Hi everyone, today we're going to learn a little bit more about validity because when we measure something in psychology or other sciences as well, we want to make sure that our measure is both reliable and valid. Reliability asks, is this thing or this measure measuring one and only one thing, while validity asks, is it measuring the correct thing? And we want to make sure that our measure has both of these, that they are reliable and they're valid. Now, when we assess its validity, there are actually a number of different sort of parts to validity. And when we think about like publishing a measure or seeking out identifying a measure that's already been published, we want to ensure that it's both valid and reliable. And there are a number of different types of validity that we would potentially assess it for. Now, most studies or most published scales don't actually test every single type of validity, but rather they test some combination of these different types of validity, and then it's up to the reader to decide it sort of is this valid enough for me to use, or the reviewers to decide is this valid and reliable enough to publish. Now, when we look at scales, the first sort of piece of evidence is what I call non-empirical evidence. So this is something that can be done sort of just by looking at the items and looking to the existing literature. Now, face validity is something, this is probably the least important type of validity that you could measure and assess. This is just looking at the items and asking yourself, do the items appear on their face to measure the construct of interest? So, for example, most people would expect that a self esteem questionnaire has items about whether people see themselves as a person of worth or not, or whether they have good qualities or not. So, if you were evaluating self esteem and it didn't have items like that, then you might start to question its validity because it might not be measuring the correct thing. Now, that being said, when it comes to face validity, sometimes we actually want slightly less face validity because there are some items out there that might just be sort of too obvious what you're measuring, and especially if it's measuring something potentially negative, like let's say I was assessing someone's level of racism. If it's measuring something potentially negative like that and it's highly face valid, like if you just had an item that said, how racist are you on a scale of 1 to 7, people would know exactly what you're measuring and they might answer or they might change their answer a little bit to appear more socially desirable, meaning that it's not their true measure. It's how they think society expects them to answer or how they expect the researcher expects them to answer. And so there are times that sort of a small drop in face validity, I mean, you still have to have some probably, but a small drop in face validity actually improves the overall validity and reliability of that measure by making people more truthful. So again, this is something that you do just by looking at the items. Once you know the conceptual definition, which is sort of more the dictionary definition of your construct that you're measuring, you look at the items and say, do they look like they're measuring the correct thing? The next one is content validity. This is another non-empirical evidence type of validity. You can do this just by looking at the items as well, but here you're asking, does this sort of cover all of the different pieces of this thing that we're trying to measure? Because if there were parts of the measure that were sort of left out, where if you expected that based on the previously established literature that there would be a bunch of different parts to self-esteem or something else, then you would want to see all of those different parts represented in the items. The items are sort of like puzzle pieces that go together to measure this overarching construct. And just like a puzzle, if you're missing different pieces, then you're probably not measuring the breadth of that construct. And so both of these, you evaluate the items, you look at the items. Face validity just seem like it's measuring the correct thing, and then content is a little bit more important here, that you're measuring all of the different aspects of that thing. Okay, so now we want to actually get into the more empirical evidence things. I'm going to go ahead and delete out the non-empirical here so that we can just focus on the empirical. These are the ones that are probably most important in establishing the validity of your scale. This is where you actually have to run a study, or oftentimes 2, 3, or even 5 studies in order to show the validity of your scale. Now, there are a number of different types. The first two are largely correlational. This is convergent and discriminant validity. This is asking essentially the extent to which your scale correlates in terms of convergent. When we think of converge, we think of coming together, right? The two things are converging with one another. We'd want to make sure that, and just think about it, if I'm measuring the correct thing, it makes absolute sense that that would be correlated with existing measures that it should be correlated. So, for example, assessing convergent validity requires collecting data on the measure. So, for example, these researchers did this when they created their self-report need for cognition scale, and then they correlated this with how much people value and engage in thinking, right? So they have their new scale, which is the need for cognition scale. If you didn't know, need for cognition is basically how much people want and desire to think. And so they're correlating this with how much they value and engage in thinking. And if these two things weren't correlated, it wouldn't make any sense that you were measuring the correct thing. If I create a new measure of self-esteem, I would expect that it would correlate with existing measures of self-esteem. That's what convergent validity is asking. On the other hand, discriminant is more if you are able to differentiate your new scale. So the extent to which your measures on your measure are not correlated with measures of variables that are conceptually distinct from your measure. Now, a lot of times my students get confused here where they think that a negative correlation is what we're looking for. We're not looking for a negative correlation. We are looking for no correlation here. Either no correlation or, in certain circumstances, let's say that I have a measure of narcissism and I want to, or let's say that I do have a new measure of self-esteem and I want to test its ability to discriminate my self-esteem measure from a measure of narcissism. Because if you didn't already know this, self-esteem and narcissism are two distinct constructs. Now, are they positively related with one another? Yes, narcissism and self-esteem are positively related with one another because both of those include this idea of seeing yourself in a positive light. Now, narcissism is sort of characterized as high, unstable self-esteem, whereas high self-esteem without narcissism would be more of a high, stable self-esteem based on real earned achievements and things like this. And so you would want to make sure that if you created a new measure of self-esteem, that it correlates with existing measures of self-esteem, but that it doesn't necessarily correlate to a super high level with narcissism, because these are two distinct constructs. You want to make sure that you can differentiate your new measure from that. Right, so another thing is that self-esteem is a general attitude toward the self that is fairly stable over time. It's not the same as mood, which is how good or bad one happens to be feeling right now. And so what researchers might expect is that a new measure of self-esteem should not be very highly correlated. Again, think very strong correlations here with just their mood right now in this moment. Now, might mood still be correlated with self-esteem? The answer is yes, but we wouldn't expect it to be super highly correlated, in which case we have shown discriminant validity. If it was super highly correlated with self-esteem, then we might start to think, oh wait, I might not be measuring this stable thing over time. I'm specifically measuring something in this moment. So again, convergent validity is how well a measure correlates with things that it should correlate with. Discriminant validity is its ability to discriminate from things that are similar but distinct. So perhaps the most important type of validity is going to be criterion validity. This is, does your scale actually predict outcomes that it should? And this is broken into sort of two parts. I'll be honest, I largely think of these two parts in essentially the same way. Predictive is, does your scale predict future events when it's tested at a different time point? And concurrent is, does your scale predict things that it should when tested at the same time? But really, both of these are examining, does your scale predict important outcomes that we would expect it to predict? So it's no longer just, is it correlated with those outcomes? It's, does your scale predict an outcome? Whereas concurrent is less about outcomes and more just, is it related to other relevant constructs? Down here with criterion validity, we are expecting that our scale is actually going to predict things that it should. So, for example, a measure of aggression should predict aggressive behaviors when participants are put into a laboratory task and given the opportunity to behave aggressively, right? And I'll also note that scales may also be tested at this stage, their ability to predict things in the future or in the same moment. They can also be tested for something called incremental validity, which asks if it has established criterion validity, meaning that it predicts something in a way that is better or different than existing scales. So what we would do to establish or test this is we're asking if we controlled for, and when we control for something, we include that other measure in the analysis, and we actually take out the variability that's explained by this existing measure, and we ask, once you take out that overlap with these existing measures, because like think if I created a new measure of self-esteem, it's probably going to overlap, at least to some degree, with an existing measure of self-esteem. And if I'm going to definitively show that my measure is useful, I have to show that it does something unique. And that is what incremental validity is doing. It's showing that my scale predicts outcomes above and beyond what's already out there. And so these are the major different types of validity that we actually test by running a research study. So now let's go through some examples and practice with identifying different types of validity, just so that you can see kind of what is the real world way of sort of testing this. So again, let's say a new self-esteem scale is developed and researchers aim to test what type of validity by correlating it with an established self-esteem scale, such as the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. Well, we're correlating it with an existing measure that we expect it to be correlated with. And so in this case, this type of validity would be convergent validity because we're correlating it with other measures that we expect it to be correlated with. So again, this would be convergent validity. And I tried to make that bold, but it made everything bold, so I had to undo that. So convergent validity would be the answer there. A new subjective well-being scale is developed, and we are testing for its blank validity by examining how well it predicts job performance after controlling for other pre-existing measures. Now, we already know it's something having to do with criterion validity because you're examining, does it actually predict outcomes? So we have to sort of ask ourselves, does this sound more like concurrent, in which case it's measuring the outcomes at the same time point, or does this sound more like predictive, where we're measuring at a different time point? Well, it sounds to me more like predictive because you have this subjective well-being scale and you're correlating it to job performance. Well, we'd probably have to measure job performance across a longer period of time than just in this moment. I guess it's possible that we can measure in the moment, but probably this would be predictive validity. But then I also want to point out here, it says after controlling for other pre-existing measures. Well, that bumps us up to what is called incremental validity, because this is asking, does this thing predict, and not only does it predict, but does it do it better than existing measures? So it's predictive validity, but in this case it's specifically incremental predictive validity. A new subjective well-being scale is developed and tested for what type of validity by correlating it with several established scales that we would expect to show moderate to strong correlations with the satisfaction with life scale, positive and negative affect schedule, the Rife scales of psychological well-being, and general health questionnaire and the WHO 5 well-being index. So We expect that our existing or our new scale is correlated with existing scales that seem very similar. This would be, again, convergent validity. A new social support scale is tested for what type of validity by correlating it with future outcomes like recovery from illness, longevity, and psychological resilience. Now, I want to point out we are correlating it with outcomes. So that's a key word here. So we know that it's criterion validity. And it says future outcomes, meaning that this would also be predictive validity. A new scale is created to measure depression, and researchers test its blank validity by correlating it with other established depression measures, such as the Beck Depression Inventory or the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. Both are well-known instruments for measuring the severity of depressive symptoms. We're examining, does my new scale correlate with existing measures? So this would be convergent, because we would expect that if I'm measuring the correct thing, which is depression, then I probably would want to see that my scale correlates with other measures of depression. If it didn't, well, it probably doesn't seem like we're measuring depression. And that's how validity works, is that if you failed any of these, well, it probably doesn't make sense that your new scale is measuring the correct thing. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these here so that we can see the questions. A new academic motivation scale is tested for blank validity by correlating it with academic outcomes such as GPA, class participation, and completion of assignments. Now, this could certainly be predictive validity, because you could measure it at like the beginning of the semester and then see, does it predict those outcomes over time. But it doesn't necessarily say in this case whether it's being done sort of all at the same time, because we could definitely measure just our new academic motivation scale and in the same time point, the same survey, measure GPA, class participation, and likelihood of completing assignments as self-report. So I'm going to go ahead and read it like that since we haven't had this one before. And we're going to call this, if we come back over here, this would be concurrent validity. It's in the same criterion validity as predictive, but this is actually when everything is measured at the same time point. And based on the ease of measuring all of these things, like we can ask people their GPA at the same time. We can ask them how much they participate in class at the same time as measuring this academic motivation scale. And we can measure how likely they are to complete assignments on time. Now, it is self-report. There are limitations to that, but we could probably run this all at the same time, in which case this would be concurrent validity, because we're asking, does our new scale predict these outcomes? And we're measuring everything all at the same time. So it's the concurrent portion of criterion validity. A new stress scale is tested for blank validity by examining whether it predicts health outcomes beyond what is already explained by existing measures of general health and depression. Again, this would be incremental, because we know that it's criterion validity, because we're seeing that word predicts. So we're asking, does it predict some outcome? And it's doing so above and beyond these existing measures. So it's asking, does it uniquely predict? Well, that's incremental validity. And then the last one here, a new scale measuring job satisfaction is tested for what type of validity by correlating it to organizational commitment. These scales should be related, but they should be distinct from one another. So a very high correlation would actually measure that you're not accurately measuring job satisfaction. You'd be measuring potentially something else, because if it was super highly correlated, then we would start to worry that we're actually measuring organizational commitment rather than job satisfaction. So again, we would expect them to be positively correlated, but not so much so that we would worry that I'm actually measuring the same thing. And so this would actually be discriminant validity. Can it actually distinguish from this existing measure of organizational commitment? So these are just a variety of ways that researchers might test for different types of validity, so that you were able to see that kind of breakout there.